Hello, my intro to art class. I hope you had a nice spring break, all things considered. Today we're starting the second half of the semester. This is the way the material breaks down. So we're beginning with the Renaissance. Just one quick housekeeping point about the papers, the formal analysis. So I realize many of you weren't able to go to the museum before they all closed. And it's very unlikely that they're going to reopen or we'll be able to walk around freely in a museum this semester. So what you'll do, and I've already pointed this out on the website, but I thought I would just reiterate it now. What you do, you would pick your image through the website. So, I mean, these museum websites have incredible high-resolution images of their works. So while you won't be able to walk around and really see it in person, which makes a big difference, the second best thing we can do is to work from images off the website. So that's what I'll ask you to do. So spend some time, if you haven't already, just, look at movements or areas in art history that interest you. We maybe haven't covered them, or maybe that's something that we're going to cover later on. Just choose something you like and then work on that. I can't remember exactly what the due date is. I know it's been pushed back. But if you have any issues with finishing the formal analysis before the official due date, just let me know. I'm going to be flexible, and I'll give you more time. It should be fine. So today we start with the Renaissance, and we're going to start up north in the Northern Renaissance. So we're in the 15th century in Europe today, and we're going to focus on painting in Flanders. And it's always helpful to start out with a map, as I usually do in class. So Flanders is part of modern-day Belgium, the Netherlands, Holland, and Luxembourg. So it was its own sovereign state, sovereign duchy in the 15th century. So here you have France. You already have parts of France. You have the Duchy of Burgundy down here, and then we're gonna be up here in Flanders. So there's some key characteristics of the 15th century Northern Renaissance that we want to keep in mind. So these are the big macro historical themes and issues that we want to start with, so we can understand how art changes during this time and what the Renaissance is all about. So the first thing we want to understand, and this is a broad generalization, but it's true that this is the moment where we start to move from a feudal economy, so the economy of lords and servants or serfs that basically give their labor to have a place to a place to live, things to eat. They're basically taken care of by the lord, so they don't have, let's say, the freedom to make their own products, to have their own capital, to own their own things, right? So we start to move from that feudal economy to something that looks more like capitalism. So this is a very early stage of capitalism. What we live in is a very late stage of global capitalism. But it is true that it's around this time where we see this shift. And it starts sooner. It starts in Northern Europe. I think Antwerp is the first place to have a stock exchange. And so this market economy based on capitalism, based on private citizens, so no longer just nobles, no longer just royals, private citizens start to accrue their own wealth, start to have their own capital, and you have the result of this is really world historical. It's quite incredible. You have the formation of a new economic class. So this would be called the merchant class, or sometimes you'll hear this class be called the class of burghers, or you can think of them as the burgeoning bourgeoisie. So these are private citizens that are accruing wealth. Okay, this is really important. So the way this is going to influence art making is that now, we're almost kind of tired and bored of talking about art that's been commissioned by the church or that's been commissioned by kings, right? It seems that the history of patronage we've been tracing since the beginning of class, at least going back to classical Greece. What we're talking about are very important political rulers who are commissioning works of art. Now, for the first time in history, what we're going to talk about are private people, private citizens, wealthy ones, right? This is elite. But still, these are now private citizens who are accruing wealth, and they're able to commission works of arts and have relationships with artists that fall under the definition of patronage. So we talk about new forms of patronage. And this will then change the way paintings, this will change the way art looks. Will change the taste of art making to a certain degree. So we'll talk about that today. The other thing that's important, and that's related, is that whereas for the most part we've been talking about art as a very public affair, especially in the history of the religions that we've covered in this class, because of this new emerging class of private citizens, private devotional activities are going to become very important. So we're going to look at a very famous painting. It's a very small little painting that was meant for the home, that was meant only for the wealthy patron and, of course, the friends and people that would be able to see it inside the home. But private devotional activities become really important. So this, too, will change the format and the shape of art making. For Northern Renaissance painters, we're still going to be working within a visual vocabulary of Christianity. This is still a thoroughly Christian worldview in Europe at this time. So a lot of the iconography of the work that we look at will tap into stories from Christianity, biblical stories. So this is a very famous triptych. Triptych means it has 3 panels. So 1, 2, 3. This is made in oil paint, which we're going to talk about a little bit today. It changes the quality of the work. And this is an adoration. So this is in Bethlehem. And you have shepherds and magi that come and they adore the Christ child, who is sitting on the ground here glowing. Right. So this is this pretty incredible triptych by Hugo van der Goes. It's very famous. And the thing you notice here is that, yes, okay, so we have this story from Christian iconography, but it's placed in a setting that it's almost as important that it's this incredible natural landscape. And there's an obsession of detail. So if we had this in bigger, we had details, we could see the flowers, we could see the landscape. There's some of these paintings where you can even like research the botany of the time from the painting. That's how exact. Like you can know what grew, where this painter was working at the time outside from the painting. That's how obsessed and how rich these Northern Renaissance painters are. These paintings are when it comes to depicting nature. This is distinct from the Southern Renaissance. The Southern Renaissance is going to be more involved with the human body, more idealized. Whereas Northern painters, we're starting to see a depiction of nature in a way that's exact, minute, and it's gorgeous. It's really, really wonderful painting. And the other large-scale issue that sort of builds off of itself from these first themes is the rise of the sense of individuality. So this might sound strange. So individuality of both the artist and the citizen, but it's such second nature for us. It's like a knee-jerk thing to think that a human being is an individual, that we're all individuals, right? But you have to understand, one of the interesting things to think through about history is that this is a concept of the self, a concept of the individual that's historical, right? In some ways, it's accrued throughout history. There are really famous arguments that Shakespeare, the concept of the modern individual, of the self, of as we understand someone as a self, is something that comes out of Shakespeare. Or Shakespeare is the first to sort of formalize it in language. Whereas before, there was no concept of individuality or the self in the same way. So maybe human beings before this period thought of themselves as, part of a large mass, part of the... you might say like the Holy Spirit of Christendom, right? They wouldn't maybe understand themselves as an individual distinct from other people, in the same way that a more modern conception of the self. This takes us down a whole philosophical, historical rabbit hole, so we're not going to talk about it too much. But it is important to note that you do start to see this reflected in the work, so that we start to see an emphasis on the artist as an individual. So this is Yann Van Eyck, the most important painter that we're going to talk about in this first half of today's lecture, but also of the citizen, right? So that you're going to see patrons, you're going to see people from this merchant class. They're actually going to show up in the work as individuals, right? So they're going to understand their place in society as important individuals. So this is an interesting way of understanding history. The history of individualism itself is kind of a fascinating concept. So that's it for the large scale issues, and they're going to unfold throughout the works that we look at. But before we get to our specific case studies, which will be from Yann Van Eyck, and this actually is Yann Van Eyck. This is his painter's workshop. This is a studio where he would have worked. I do want to set up a few more, let's say, practical concerns about this time period. So I think we want to know, how did artists work? So if we have this changing conception of the artist as more of an individual, we have this changing economy at the time, then we want to understand, well, how is it that artists were working? So I think the first thing you want to understand is that artists, it's not the conception yet of the romantic artist who's off on his own and he's doing whatever he wants. And I'm using he consciously here because it is mainly men who are allowed to become painters, who are allowed to study with and apprentice with painters. So it's very gendered. It's going to take a while for women to get their due in history, and that's true art history. That's right. So, but don't think of the painter or the artist as this solitary genius working, doing whatever he wants, in his studio somewhere. This is not yet the conception of the artist. So the artist will be part of a guild, usually a painter's guild or a sculptor's guild or an architectural guild. He will have his own workshop where he has apprentices, so like young men who come in and start to study with him. He'll have older assistants, and this is the other thing that might be surprising, is that you think of the artist as making a work, and the work is fully his. But oftentimes during this period, and even Yann Van Eyck, this would be true. He might make the drawing for the painting. And this is a painting of St. George slaying the dragon. He might make the drawing, and he might finish up some of the color at the end, but some of it may actually be painted by the more talented, the more advanced assistants. Right? So some of these paintings may actually be more collaborative than you might think. And in the workshop, you'd have all these assistants doing all sorts of things. So like one might be doing a portrait on the left. These two younger ones are probably doing studies, so they're being apprentices. And on the right here, you see assistants making the paint, making the materials used to make the art. And this gets us then to a big change in the Northern Renaissance, and that has to do with oil paint. So Yann Van Eyck for a long time was credited, or he claimed himself, or maybe this was Vasari, a claim that he invented oil paint, that he was the first to use it. And this is actually not true. Oil paint was used all the way back in the 8th century. But it is true that Yann Van Eyck popularizes it, and it's in the 15th century where we start to see oil paint being used more and more and more, especially in the north. Not so much in the south. In the south, you're going to see the second half of today's class, the south is much more still about tempera paint, about water-based, egg-based pigment, whereas oil starts to become prevalent earlier in the north. So this has key changes. So this is Lapis Lazuli. This is a blue pigment. It's the most expensive mineral, and so it was the most expensive color. It was more expensive actually than gold. So when you see this beautiful deep blue in a painting, it's actually more valuable than if it would have been gilded with gold, right? And so painters and attendants would make the oil themselves, right? You don't yet have stores where you just go buy tubes of paint. The paint would be made by hand with the natural resources themselves. So you'd have linseed oil, usually it's linseed oil made from cotton, mixed with pigment, and then this paint would be used by the painter and by the more advanced assistants. So the key thing that you're going to see with our examples today with oil paint is that it's a very rich and lustrous, has a very rich and lustrous quality. Tempera paint, fresco, most of the paint that we've studied so far in this semester and that the Southern early Renaissance is still using, that has a lighter quality, less saturated, almost more kind of watercolor, more diaphanous. So it's a different quality. Oil paint is much richer, deeper, saturated. It has like this luster to it, right? So visually it has that quality, but then technically, like the logistics of using it, there's also a difference. Oil paint takes much longer to dry. So fresco paint, especially if it's wet fresco, you have to paint very quickly. You have to do it very quickly because it dries, and once it dries, that's it, right? Oil paint takes longer to dry because of the quality of the oil itself. And so painters can be more lavish, they can be more meticulous, and the paint can actually move around, and you can make glazes. You can like build the paint up, almost like this structural effect, which will then change the quality of the feel of the color and of the paint itself. So this is no coincidence then, if we're talking about Northern Renaissance painting as being, gorgeous painting that's finely tuned to detail of nature, and all this meticulous obsession with nature and the human body and clothing and everything. It's no coincidence that oil paint becomes so prevalent. It's like these are things that just work so well together. So keep the form of the paint in mind, the material of the paint in mind as we look at our examples. So for the first part of this class, we're going to talk about Flanders, and we're going to talk about first a very famous church altarpiece. Oh, actually, I think two famous church altarpieces, one of which is in New York City. And then we're going to finish with a very famous private devotional image. Okay? So let's start with the public church altarpiece. And here's where we get to this is usually considered one of the great works in all of Western art history. It's an incredible painting. It's Yann Van Eyck's Ghent altarpiece. It's in St. Bavo Cathedral in modern-day Belgium. It's oil on wood, and it's a multi-paneled work. So it's actually a replica. This is St. Bavo Cathedral. If you go there today, you'll be able to see this, but you won't be able to see the original. The original is fragile. They only show it and select at select moments. So like the everyday showing of the work is actually a recreation of it, right? So this is the recreation of it. But I wanted to show it to you just so that you can get a good sense of scale. These are people in front of it, right? So it's this massive, massive altarpiece, multi-paneled. What is it, like 15 panels or something like that? So you have panels on the left here, panels inside, and panels on the right. So this altarpiece open, right? This is open. So I think you can tell these are hinges, right? It's not fully flat. These are doors. So keep that in mind. That's the structural aspect of this painting. And so if we go in and look at a nicer reproduction of the actual Ghent altarpiece, so no longer in situ, no longer in the St. Bavo Cathedral. Now we're looking at the image itself. We're going to first look at it closed. So just think of these hinges here as closing, so that you're seeing the outside of these panels, and this now becomes hidden, right? So the doors have closed, so you're seeing the outside of the doors. This is the way we're going to look at it first. So what do you have? I'm sorry. I jumped the gun there. What do we have? On the bottom here, we have the patrons. The man and wife who commissioned this work from Yann Van Eyck, paid for it, for St. Bavo Cathedral, right? So they're the patrons. And this is an act of, this is both like a personal act of doing something good, right? But it's also contributing to the church, contributing to society. So this would be the role that the patron would envision for himself, right? So this is the patron and his wife, who we know. I don't remember their names exactly. I mean, we could look it up. So we know who they are. So they're there as individuals, right? And they're in the work itself, right? So we saw this with Giotto actually at the Scrivini Chapel, but here it's becoming even more prominent. They're right there. They look like they're alive. They look like living human beings in the way they're painted, and they're basically praying to these two saints. So we have St. John the Baptist and St. John the Evangelist here, and they're depicted as statues, right? So that's what you have on the bottom panel in these very beautiful, this still looks almost Gothic kind of ornamentation there, all painted. Then at the top here, as if you're in a house, you have Mary, and then over here, Archangel Gabriel. Archangel Gabriel is holding lilies. This is a sign for purity. Mary has a dove on the top of her head. Whenever you see a dove, I mean, this connotes peace often, but in Christian iconography, it often symbolizes the Holy Spirit, the community of Christendom. And this is called an Annunciation scene. We're going to see so many Annunciation scenes. It becomes very, very popular. But this is essentially the moment where Archangel Gabriel is telling her that she's going to conceive God for Christians, that she's going to conceive the Christ child, right? And in some images, and I'll show you one, you actually see, it's called the Incarnation, the Immaculate Conception. Not the Incarnation, the Immaculate Conception. You actually see it happening in the work itself. She actually does become pregnant with the Christ child. So this is a very holy scene, but note how it's actually in a domestic interior that does not look like, let's say, the first 2 decades of the Common Era, right? Of the time of the biblical time. This looks like 15th century Flanders. This is a key aspect of Flemish painting and Northern Renaissance painting. This looks like a nice domestic interior of a home in Flanders, and you even see like the city on the outside there, right? So there's something anachronistic about the setting with the religious figures. And then on top you have 2 Sibyls and 2 Old Testament prophets. So this goes back to the idea of prefiguration. They're important figures in the Old Testament that prefigure the New Testament, right? So this is a story from the New Testament. You even have this one up here. He has a Bible. He's probably even like pointing to where he's prefigured the story of the New Testament and the coming of Christ and so on and so forth for Christians. So that's the iconography of the outside of the Ghent altarpiece. But what's even more interesting than the story itself, the fact that you have the patrons, the fact that you have the Annunciation scene, is the way it's been depicted. So you'll notice maybe the key character on the outside of this painting is not a person, but it's light itself. So Yann Van Eyck he was really brilliant, right? A really brilliant painter. And so you notice at first something less than brilliant, something that doesn't make sense at the level of light, right? It's as if the artist has made a terrible mistake. And now us, back in history, we look and laugh at this terrible mistake, right? So maybe you can already see you've already noticed the terrible mistake at the level of light. You have light from the outside here, right? It looks like it's daytime on the outside of this setting. And yet, weirdly enough, you have these shadows that don't make any sense at all with the daylight outside. Like, how in the world would this... how would there be a shadow here or here? And how would the shadows even work with Mary and Archangel Gabriel here, right? It's as if he's made a terrible mistake. This scene should be sort of flooded with light coming from the window in the back. But it's not a mistake once you realize and you know that Yann Van Eyck knew where this would be positioned in the church itself, in St. Pavos Cathedral. And he knew that basically to the right here, that's where the light source would be in the church itself, right? So once you know that, you realize that he's actually used the real light source of the church itself, of the actual space that this object is in, and he mimicked it. So the light that's casting on these statues, on the patrons, on the Annunciation scene, the light that's casting this shadow here, that makes this look like a window, makes it look like it's a window onto another world, that light matches up with the real light of the church. So what you have is not a mistake here. What you have is almost like a competition between two light sources. You have the fake, the illusory, the painterly real light of the outside world inside the painting, going up against the less illusory, the very real light of St. Bavo Cathedral itself that this painting is in. Right? So we have these two light sources in competition. And this is where this kind of incredible symbolism comes in, because he's made one light source stronger than the other. He's made one, if we are going to think of it as a type of luminal competition, one is winning. And which one is winning? I think you can guess. It's the light from the church itself, which, if you remember back to theories of Abbot Suger and Lux Nova, the light in a church, in a cathedral, is holy light. It's divine. So it's more important, it's more powerful than just mundane terrestrial light outside the church, right? So it's a very, very cool competition that he's placed within this work. The divine light, the real divine light that's in the church where this painting is in, he's depicted to win out and to be stronger than the outside light. Because if the outside light were stronger, you wouldn't have shadows here, and the shadow play along the whole scene on the outside here would be quite different, right? So very, very meticulous, very attentive to these details, and an incredible use of light. So this is how you would see the painting on a normal day. But on Sundays, on feast days, on important celebration days, the altarpiece would be opened. And on those select days, you'd be able to see what's inside, what's underneath the panel. So this is the inside of the outside of those panels that we just saw. And of course, once it opens, the whole thing is much bigger. You get to see more panels because you get to see what's behind the closed doors. And you have these 4 large panels in the center here, right? And it's a very different mood. So this is slightly more muted. It's a lovely scene, but it's slightly more muted. Whereas when you open it up, you have all this color. It's much more vibrant. It's much busier. And you almost get the sense that, you know, you're hearing a chorus of angels, and you're hearing an organ, and you're hearing like all this this stuff emanating from this dramatic opening of the altarpiece. And in fact, on the top here, let's start with the top. On the top, you do have angels singing here. You have a chorus of angels. And you have someone playing an early organ, an early version of the organ and other instruments. And you would have music in these churches. And Yann Van Eyck is so attentive to details. There are all these, like, I guess maybe we call them Easter eggs today. You can see barely like a figure right in the back here. You have hair and like red cloth, red fabric here, like the shoulder or something like that. So why is that person back there? That person is back there because this is before organs that would play on their own, right? That would supply their own air with pedals. This one was still manual. You had to have someone back there on the bellows pumping the air through the organ so that this person would have air and sound running through the organ. So he's just got these unbelievable little details throughout all his paintings. So of course, in the center, you're seeing Christ, God, and the Holy Spirit. You're seeing the Trinity, and I think you can tell how he's depicted. This is an image of Christ as king. This is a royal depiction of Christ, of Christianity as his kingdom. So it's reinforced by the crown that's on the ground, and I've always loved this ground for some reason. This pattern on the ground. He's wearing like a royal robe. He has a scepter. He has a crown on his head. So this is Christ as king. This is Mary to his left, obviously. And this is St. John the Baptist, who is the patron saint of St. Bavo Cathedral, right? So they're on either side. Funny enough, the figures that are most famous from the altarpiece are actually on the sides, all on the wings. And I think you can guess who they are. This is Eve, and this is Adam. These are very, very famous. And these are famous for a couple reasons. These are the first large-scale nude renderings of the human body since antiquity. Right? So this has to do with the idea of the Renaissance that we'll talk about in a moment. They're also famous because they tell us about the way in which artists could and could not use models. So people notice that Adam, the male, he's much more naturalistic. He looks much more like a real human being. There's even this incredible detail of foreshortening here, where you're seeing movement from the front, something coming out at you. It looks like his foot's going to come out of the panel. He has hair. He even has like a suntan, like a farmer's tan, right? So the hands and the legs are more tan than the body that would normally be covered up, as well as the face. So they're pretty sure that there was a sitter for this, that there was a nude model for Yann Van Eyck, whereas Eve does not look as naturalistic. And she actually, a lot of people think that she's pregnant, but this kind of more, let's say, in a nice way, like this more pear-shaped body, that was a convention. That was a convention for the female body. Conventions of beauty of the female body changed throughout history, right? This is maybe very different from the competing conception of female beauty, rightly or wrongly, that we have today. Just keep in mind that these conceptions change, right? And so there's Eve, and she probably was a type, right? The figment of Yann Van Eyck's painterly imagination rather than a model. So, because there's something much more naturalistic about Adam. And you can tell this is after the fall, right? They've sinned. She's holding the apple, and she's covering herself with a fig leaf in shame, as is Adam, right? So you know it's after the fall, and they've probably been expelled from Eden. So this is a depiction of original sin for Christians. And then on the top, you notice little, they almost look like little pewter statues or something like that. This is Cain and Abel, so the offspring of Adam and Eve in the Christian story. And here is Cain and Abel giving their offerings to God. So Cain was a farmer. He grew grain and vegetables and so on and so forth. So that's what he gave to God. Whereas Abel was also a farmer, but of livestock. So he's slaughtering an animal to offer up to God. God only accepts the animal sacrifice, which leads Cain to become jealous, and that's why Cain kills Abel. Right. So if here we have original sin typified in Adam and Eve, with Cain and Abel, you have basically like the first murder in history, at least within the Christian scripture. So all these images are working together. And then at the bottom of the altarpiece, you have the mystic lamb. You have a lamb up here. Sometimes this work is called actually the mystic lamb. I don't have a bigger detail for you, but the lamb has basically been punctured at the throat, and blood is spilling out from the throat of the lamb. It's going into this chalice and down into this well. This is the well of life, and it's even going further down into the ground, right? So this is a scene of sacrifice, another scene of animal sacrifice. But of course, this lamb is not just a lamb, right? Notice these angels holding up. Sorry about that. Notice these angels holding up a cross. That tells you that this is not actually a lamb. This is Christ, right? This is a rendering through the animal of a scene of the crucifixion itself, which would have been also, a scene of sacrifice, of a father sacrificing his son. And for the astute out there, for those who remember that Old Testament story of Abraham and Isaac, there's also a sheep or a ram involved in that one. So maybe in some sense, this is referring back to the Old Testament and the sacrifice of father and son in the story of Abraham and Isaac. And then basically the rest of this panel, you have knights, you have ascetics, you have priests, you have the poor, you have basically every single demographic of Northern Renaissance society. They come to witness this sacrifice, to witness this event, right? But again, while this looks like this heavenly natural place, there are also elements of it that put us firmly within that day of the Northern Renaissance, the Flemish Renaissance. This is one of those paintings where scholars have studied like the trees, the flowers, the foliage, like the whole botany, the whole flora of this scene, of this landscape. And they've been able to understand what was growing and how nature looked back then, all those centuries ago, through Yann Van Eyck's attention. So it's a religious scene with his uncanny attention to natural details and a natural landscape. So then it all works together in a very clear way, right? Original sin, the Christ and the heavenly realm here, and then the crucifixion and the sacrifice because of original sin for Christians. So this will be a very, very loaded, very complex painting. And it works very nicely from closed to open, as I think you can tell. Oh, there'd be a lot more to say about this work, but I think I've spent a little too much on it. So let me just tell you that there's the history of this work won't be over when we talk about the iconoclasm with the Protestant Renaissance, Protestant Reformation. That'll be next week. We're going to talk about this work again. We could also bring its history in the 20th century, in World War II. So you might be surprised to find that the Nazis, especially Goering and Hitler, they actually had a tug of war with this work. This was their favorite work. They loved this work. And the Nazis in World War II stole a lot of art. I mean, still today there are lawsuits trying to get Nazi-looted, stolen art back to its rightful place. So this is probably the most famous painting that was taken and then ultimately liberated by the Allies, right, by U.S. troops. And so this is a very famous photograph of Allies, of U.S. troops, looking at, they've just found the Ghent Altarpiece, and you notice, like, parts have been damaged. It had to be restored, and the panels were all taken apart, right? So this is, as a work of art, it was actually part of the liberation of World War II, which is a really interesting story. And I think this was made into a movie, or part of this story was made into a movie called Monuments Men, with George Clooney and other very famous people. I never saw it. I didn't hear very good reviews about it, but maybe if you're interested in the story, it might be fun to watch. So now we move on to private devotional images. So these are smaller images that are commissioned by individual patrons that are meant for the home. So whereas the Ghent Altarpiece was commissioned by patrons, but meant to be, benefacted, they're benefactors of the cathedral, of the public space for their city, for their town. These works are private devotional images that are commissioned by private citizens, and they're destined for their home. Right. So this is a very different, new economy for art. This is a big part of this first half of today's chapter. And before we look at our two examples, I think I have two examples. Yes, two examples. I do want to talk a little bit about symbols and what they are, cultural symbols. So they seem like really obvious to us, right? When I show you these icons, you know what they mean. I mean, almost all of you probably know exactly what all these mean. So this is control, this is at, this is pause, this is start or go, this is the turn on symbol, this is the USB symbol, and this is the Bluetooth symbol, right? So I mean, who knows? Maybe you didn't know all of these, but they're more or less part of our, like, the field of our contemporary symbols, right? It's very tricky, like why these symbols have been chosen and how we know what they mean. This could send us down into a rabbit hole of the philosophy of language and of signs. So there are some ways in which these signs could be totally arbitrary. Like, I have no idea why Bluetooth, I mean, maybe it looks like a B. I have no idea why the command, the symbol looks like that. The play symbol, I guess, makes sense, right? Because it's pointing forward, so like you're playing something. But of course, that's very Western, right? To go from left to right. What about cultures that read from right to left? Maybe they wouldn't read that as forward. Pause, right? All these things are maybe somewhat arbitrary, but yet you know what they mean. You know what they mean. So I want you to envision, think of like the worst happens and we actually do destroy the earth because of climate change. And thousands of years from now, everything is underwater and human civilization is gone. a very dreary scenario. Hopefully we're gonna have the political will to avoid that kind of scenario, but a dreary scenario to think about right now. But think about it. All that's left now are some of the stuff we've built, right? And then littered throughout the landscape are these little tablets that aliens come down and they find all these tablets, they find all these computers, and they see all the symbols. How would they reconstruct what these symbols mean? Like they wouldn't know off the bat what these symbols mean, even if they had the concept of symbol, the concept of language as we understand it, right? So how would they know? I guess they'd have to do some research. They'd have to, first of all, learn English or learn an equivalent human language. They'd then have to read manuals of computers, if these manuals still even exist, right? It would not be clear to them. It would not be like the air that they breathe like it is for us. And so when we look at these Flemish paintings, I want you to think of them in the same way, because they're littered with symbols. They're littered with these kind of symbols. And we almost become these aliens 500 years later who are confronted with these symbols, but we don't know what they mean. Or we have to do quite a bit of work to be able to understand what they once meant, right? This is a key feature of Northern Renaissance paintings. It's teeming with symbols. Some of them are obvious, and some of them are not so obvious, and they're kind of elusive, and maybe art historians haven't figured out, and maybe we never will figure out exactly what they mean, right? But it's a key feature of these paintings of the Northern Renaissance, especially Flemish painting. So this is the very famous Meerut altarpiece, and I'll give it to you as an example. This is actually up at the cloisters. This is up at the Met, in the Met collection. So one day when we're out of quarantine, you can go see this amazing painting in person. So it's by the workshop of the master of Flamand. There's some people contest as to who this painter actually was. What we do know for sure is that it's another Annunciation scene. So here's Archangel Gabriel. Here's Mary, who's like kneeling humbly on what is that called again? Like a pew, right? Reading on a pew, reading the Bible with this white cloth. And you notice from the window, this little man on a cross is flying through like this golden ray of light and headed straight towards Mary. So you're almost seeing the Immaculate Conception play out in this scene. And notice how the figure is going through the window but not breaking the window. So this is actually a scene of virginity, of purity, of staying intact, right? And you have symbols of this throughout this painting, of virginity, of chastity, of purity. So we've talked about this before. Lilies, you have white lilies on the table. These are symbols of purity. The towel and the napkin that she's holding, the white napkin, those are symbols of purity. Less obvious maybe would be the screen in the fireplace. May very well also be a symbol of purity and chastity. So this thing is teeming with symbols. You have more up here, like the kettle is a symbol. You have symbols up here that scholars are still debating. They don't understand. You have one candle up here, and then this one is missing a candle. So why that little detail? It may very well be a symbol. It may have meaning, but we don't quite know what it is. So these Northern Renaissance paintings are just teeming with these symbols. On the right here you have Joseph, who was a carpenter, and he's making mouse traps. So one of the cliches, one of the tropes of Satan is that he's a mouse, along with flies and along with other like goats and horned and hooved animals and that sort of thing. One of the animal avatars of the devil, of Satan, is the mouse. And so he's making mouse traps. So mouse traps, then it becomes like symbolic of capturing or killing the devil. And again, notice this is not Palestine circa early 1st century, right? This looks like northern Flemish Renaissance town with a square and everything. Then on the left here, you have once again the patron. So this is the guy who commissioned this work, and he's looking in on this scene from outside, right? So he positioned himself in a very important space. And then a nice little note, this is his wife, who he actually married after the painting was made, so she was added later, maybe by another painter, so she's behind him, which I find that kind of funny. I wonder if there's a moment in the history of art where, this is, I guess, before divorces, but what if a patron gets divorced and then the guy's like, I'm going to just go ahead and erase her out of the image? I guess we wouldn't know. But probably the most famous private devotional image, and the one we're going to end on, is Yann Van Eyck's, we get back to Yann Van Eyck, is Giovanni Arnolfini and his bride. And this is often just called the Arnolfini portrait for short, and that's fine. It's a smaller work. It was meant for the home of Arnolfini, and here he is in full regalia. So the painting is a depiction of his home, and the painting itself would be destined for that home. So there's kind of this meta quality to this painting. He's wearing this very large hat, very ostentatious, very expensive fur-trimmed coat. He was a wealthy merchant of textiles, of fabric. So this is how he accrued his wealth. So you're seeing, really for the first time, the depiction in a work of art of this wealthy merchant class that's emerging in northern Europe. I had a lot of students tell me he looks like Vladimir Putin, the quote-unquote president of Russia. And I guess I do see a resemblance. So if you see that, so maybe you see it too. It's a funny little anachronistic detail. So this is another one of those paintings where it's just littered, it's teeming with symbols. So let's go through them, and that way we'll sort of understand the work a little bit better. So on the bottom left here, you have these clogs. They're dirty, so you can tell that he wore them and he just came from the outside. But clogs also had religious significance for the sacrament of marriage. So in wedding ceremonies, clogs would be used to designate the fact that this is holy ground. So I don't think this is used anymore in weddings today. It might be. But this is not a symbol that's like in the air for us. This is not an obvious symbol. So these clogs as symbols of the sacrament of marriage. Then we have this little Pucci right in the front, and he would be the symbol of something that's very obvious that we still use today, and that would be faithfulness or fidelity, right? Dogs are coded as faithful. And this makes sense within the context of marriage, right? So you're starting to note the theme of this painting. It's his bride. This seems to have something to do with the sacrament of marriage. This is a devotional image for their marriage, right? Another one, you have the whisk, this broom, and then a little figurine of Saint Margaret on the top of the bed here. And you should know that beds at this time weren't in separate bedrooms. Like beds would be part of the large living room, like even the place where people would receive guests, right? So unless you have a studio apartment in New York, you normally don't have your bed in your living room, a place where you have, you have where you entertain people. But that was the case back then. So here you have a filial of Saint Margaret, who's the patron saint of childbirth, right? So this again feeds into this painting as a painting of the sacrament of marriage, because of course back then, and it's still some places today, childbirth and marriage go together, right? The point of marriage is to be able to have a child. At the top here, you have this really ornate chandelier, and there's, again, this small little detail that Yann Van Eyck gives us. There's only one candle on this whole chandelier, and it's right here, and it's lit. And so sometimes it's read as the all-seeing eye of God above them, right? It's just this one candle looking over the whole scene, which makes a certain amount of sense for the sacrament of marriage. But I've also read one scholar argue that the candle represents life. So the candle is above Arnolfini, so he's alive. He's still alive when this portrait is being made, whereas the candle that should be on top of the wife is actually gone or extinguished. And it's mysterious. They're not sure, but it's very likely that she died, may have died in childbirth, and that she wasn't alive for this painting. That this painting both commemorates their marriage, but also maybe is like a memorial to her, right? So maybe this is a subtle little sign that she's actually passed away. All this is highly contested. It's a very contested painting in art history. Then on the left here, we have this window with these oranges, which would designate, a few things. They would designate fertility. They would designate regeneration, fruit, anything that bears its own seed in the history of art often represents birth, rebirth, or being, what's a good word? Being fecund, being fertile, right? So this would also, these oranges are not just oranges. They may also be symbolic of generation, of family, and of birth, and of being of having fertility, right? Then in the back there we have a mirror. The mirror itself shows the whole passion play of Christ on the cross, but then the mirror itself inside, it shows you the room itself, right? And this is a wonderful device that Yann Van Eyck used, that a lot of painters will use later on, because if you put a mirror inside of a painting, then you get to see what's on the end of the painting, of the place you're in, that you as the viewer cannot see, right? In film theory, this is called suturing. So when a director goes into a room and you walk into the room with the camera, and then the shot reverses, and then you get to see the other side of the room, that's called suturing, right? That way you can see where the character is cohesively in the space, right? This is why a lot of horror films, they won't suture shots. You'll go into a space and then you won't be able to see what's behind you, right? So that it creates this sort of creepy effect. So here you're getting a suturing of the room, and you might expect to see Yann Van Eyck painting, right? That would make sense, because he's logically, you would think that here you have Arnolfini, you have his bride, and Yann Van Eyck is there painting the very portrait that you're seeing, but you don't. You see two people that have walked into the room, and so you know that they're guests, that they're entertaining, and Arnolfini is basically like offering up his bride, showing her off in some way, right? And a bride, would be would be more within the status of property for within the marriage for the man than we would like to think. It's very different from today, right? And then at the top there, very large, almost like John Hancock on the Declaration of Independence, this is Yann Van Eyck's signature with the date of the painting. So he's actually put his signature on the wall inside the room, maybe attesting to how important he thinks of himself as an artist. So now we put it all together, and I think you can tell it's just teeming with all these symbols. And you can go in and ask all these, because it has all these rich details, you can go in and ask all these questions that are in some ways obvious, but that some are less obvious, and they tell you a lot about that time period. So you could ask about religious history, right? What was the understanding of the sacrament of marriage at this time? We've answered a lot of that. You can talk about economic history, right? We've talked a bit about that too. For the first time, you're seeing a merchant class be able to commission this painting, to have this lavish home. This little guy, I think he's a terrier, right? A Griffin Terrier, if you know your dog breeds. Today we have horrible puppy mills, and people buy animals. People buy dogs like they're buying, like vacuum cleaners or something like that. It's just like an object to buy. They even have you can buy them as gifts for Christmas or something like that, right? They're not really. They're all over the place. Back then, to have a dog, especially a breed like this was to be a luxury item, like a real luxury item. And I suppose there still are breeds today that are deemed to be luxury items. But this guy would be more than just fidelity and faithfulness within the marriage. He would also attest to the wealth of of Arnolfini, as the bed, as the domestic interior, as this rug, as the fabric of their clothing. All of this would attest to his economic class, right? You could go in and talk about gender, social gender roles. So what does it mean to be a woman in a marriage at this time, and what does it mean to be a man? There are all these little details here that if we had more time, we would spend on them. Like, again, his clogs are dirty. You get the sense that he can go in and out of the apartment whenever he wants, or the house whenever he wants. He's the one who's in the marketplace. He's in the great outdoors. He's the one doing all this stuff. Whereas she, you don't even see her feet. She looks like she's more or less tied to the bed, and tied to the domestic interior, right? So you're almost getting these gender roles of male, female being expressed in the painting itself, changing importance of the artist, right? We talked about that with the signature on the wall. We're going to talk about the age of exploration and colonization, right? So this is the moment where the New World is starting to open up. This is going to have huge ramifications for Europe, for the history of art, and non-Western peoples are going to start getting colonized in the Americas, in Africa, and in the Far East. And you're going to start to see products, natural resources that you hadn't seen before. Like, believe it or not, tea and coffee. Like, people weren't drinking tea and coffee yet. Coffee you have every morning, or at least I do. But this was a novel colonial export at the time. And so these oranges, you can't just go to the store and buy oranges at this time. Right? This would be something that would come from further away, from much further away from Flanders. So these oranges not only represent fertility and marriage and regeneration and so on and so forth, but they also attest to his economic class, the fact that he's wealthy, and they also attest to this burgeoning global economy built on exploration and built on colonization. History of fashion. You see what he's wearing, you see what she's wearing. A lot of people note, people say that she thinks she has horns. These aren't horns. The hair is pinned up with this fabric that she wears on her head. This was part of the fashion of the time, right? So you get to see the history of the fashion of the time. He's wearing tights and clogs and so on and so forth. You might think of the history of the city and the home. You're getting to see what a home would look like within a city. You're also starting to see the Western relation between the natural world and the domestic space. So the more people accrue wealth, the more they can afford having domestic settings that seem to be separate from the natural world. So you no longer have your livestock, you no longer have dust and dirt, all this stuff like in your home, the inside and the outside, it's kind of porous. Here you're seeing a conception of the home as this bubble, as this space that's sort of separate and protected from the rest of the city and the rest of the natural world. So that's also a history that you can trace in this painting. And you can also trace, remember, we're doing all this work is stuff that maybe Yann Van Eyck wasn't even thinking of, or Arnolfini wasn't thinking of. This is the level of ideology. The ideas are in there that they didn't know they were thinking, that they didn't know was there, but that we now, with the hindsight of centuries, and of this whole history under our belt, we can now see these ideas. This ideology that was transparent and unseen to them, but for us, we can see it. So one of the prime examples is this idea of speciesism, which you may or may not know, but it's the idea that discrimination can happen at the level of species. Right? So there are all sorts of ways in which discrimination can happen. You can discriminate someone because of the religion they have. You can discriminate someone because of the color of their skin. You can discriminate someone because of their sexual disposition. There's so many ways discrimination can happen. And there are some ethicists and some philosophers that have, in the past 30 years or so, they've started to talk about speciesism. So discriminating at the level of species. So you'll discriminate, you'll love a dog, but you'll not you, but people will love dogs, but then also pay someone to kill a pig to then eat that pig, right? There's a cognitive dissonance. There seems to be a discrimination of value value the dog, not value the pig, right? So what does that have to do with Arnolfini? What does that have to do with this portrait? Well, it's very compatible, right? Because he probably loves his little dog, she probably loves a little dog, but doesn't mind wearing mink or whatever animal that his fur is made from, right? So this is nothing that they would have thought of. This is only something that we can now think of anachronistically in history. They would not have seen it as dissonant in any way. Animals are used, they're God-given. Right, this is a totally religious worldview at the time. Man has dominion over animals, right? But us today, it might actually make us uneasy, and we might think, well, yeah, it actually doesn't make sense. Why would you tear apart the skin of one species and then love, shelter, and feed another species, right? So all these ideas, religious, economic, gender, colonization, fashion, the natural world, animals, species, these are all big ideas that are floating and imbued in this painting. So it's a very, very rich painting. And that's the end of the first part of class. So let's take our break. Again, with these lectures, you can, obviously you can do them whenever you want. You can take as long of a break as you want. But we'll be back whenever you want to do the Southern 15th century Renaissance.